Facing Change. The End of the Trustee Period in Colonial Georgia. Introduction and Experiments Twilight. When Georgia's first settlers arrived in 1733, they were stepping into the most ambitious social experiment the British Empire had ever attempted in North America. Guided by the vision of James Oglethorpe and the Board of Trustees, the colony was to be a haven for the worthy poor, a bulwark against Spanish invasion, and a model of moral and economic reform. For 2 decades, the trustees clung to ideals of equality, sobriety, and opportunity. But by the early 1750s, the grand experiment was unraveling. Oglethorpe was gone, the settlers were restless, and the colony's future lay not in London's philanthropic salons, but in the hands of royal officials and the demands of the Atlantic world. This is the story of how the trustees' utopian vision collapsed, how Georgia was transformed into a royal colony, and how a host of social, economic, and demographic changes swept through the province, leaving it forever altered. Oglethorpe's departure, the beginning of the end. The visionary leaves. James Oglethorpe was the beating heart of early Georgia, a reformer, general, and the only trustee ever to set foot in the colony he helped create. His leadership was hands-on, charismatic, and at times autocratic. He negotiated with native leaders, designed Savannah's grid, enforced the ban on slavery, and led troops against the Spanish at the Battle of Bloody Marsh. But Oglethorpe was also a polarizing figure, and by the early 1740s his influence was waning. In 1743, after a decade in Georgia, Oglethorpe left for England, never to return. His departure marked the beginning of the end for the trustees' direct engagement with the colony. Without his vision and personal authority, the trustees in London became increasingly detached from the on-the-ground realities of colonial life. The ideals begin to fray. The trustees' founding ideals, equality, small landholdings, bans on slavery and rum, and a paternalistic governance from London, had always been at odds with the desires of many settlers. Oglethorpe's departure left a leadership vacuum. Local discontent, previously held in check by his presence, began to boil over. The settlers, facing disease, economic stagnation, and a sense of powerlessness, demanded change. 2. The collapse of a utopian vision. The trustees' ideals. The trustees had imagined Georgia as a society of small farmers, free of slavery, large landowners, and the vices of urban England. Their rules were strict. Landholdings were limited to 500 acres, later 2,000, with no right to sell or bequeath land to daughters. Slavery was banned to prevent the rise of a planter aristocracy. Rum and other hard liquors were prohibited. The colony had no elected assembly. Governance was directed from London. Religious toleration was extended, except to Catholics due to fears of Spanish influence. The realities on the ground. From the outset, the trustees' rules ran into trouble. The soil and climate of coastal Georgia were poorly suited to European crops. Silk and wine, intended as staple exports, failed to thrive. Without enslaved labor, settlers struggled to clear land and turn a profit in agriculture, especially as neighboring South Carolina prospered with rice and indigo plantations. The ban on land sales and inheritance discouraged investment and stifled population growth. Meanwhile, the ban on rum was widely ignored and difficult to enforce. The absence of an elected assembly left colonists feeling voiceless, fueling resentment and, at times, open protest. Growing dissent. By the late 1740s, the colony's population was stagnant, the economy weak, and the trustees' authority increasingly challenged. Petitions to London demanded the right to own slaves, expand landholdings, and form an assembly. Many settlers left for Carolina or returned to Britain, disillusioned with the trustees' promises. 3. The transition to royal colony status, 1752, the surrender of the charter. Facing mounting pressure, declining morale, and a lack of success, the trustees reluctantly yielded to reality. In 1752, after 20 years, they surrendered their charter to the crown. Georgia became a royal colony, governed directly by the king's appointed governor and, eventually, its own elected assembly. Immediate changes. With the transition came swift reforms. Land laws, Property restrictions were eased. Land could now be bought, sold, and inherited more freely. Slavery. The ban on slavery had already been lifted in 1750. Under royal rule, the plantation system spread rapidly. Rum and trade. Restrictions on rum and trade were relaxed, integrating Georgia more fully into the Atlantic economy. Government. The colony gained a governor, a council, and by 1754, a Commons House of Assembly, giving settlers a say in their own affairs. The end of the trustees era. The trustees' utopian project was effectively over. Georgia was now on a path similar to its southern neighbors, shaped by the forces of plantation agriculture, slavery, and the market economy. 4. Social shifts. From philanthropy to plantation, a new elite emerges. The original vision of a society of equal smallholders faded as wealth, land, and political power became concentrated in the hands of a new planter elite. Many of these new leaders were immigrants from South Carolina and other colonies, drawn by the promise of land and the newly legal status of slavery. The expansion of slavery. The lifting of the slave ban in 1750 marked a turning point. Enslaved Africans became the backbone of Georgia's economy, laboring on rice, indigo, and later cotton plantations. The demographics of the colony shifted rapidly, with the enslaved population soon outnumbering free settlers in some regions. A more stratified society. With the rise of plantations came a more hierarchical society. The small, relatively egalitarian community envisioned by the trustees gave way to a system marked by sharp divisions of race, class, and wealth. Planters dominated politics and society, while small farmers, artisans, and the enslaved formed lower tiers. The role of women and families. Women's roles changed as well. Under the trustees, women could not inherit land, but royal governance slowly expanded their legal and economic rights, especially among the upper classes. Family structures became more diverse, with a growing number of mixed-race children born under slavery, some of whom would play important roles in Georgia's future. Economic transformation. From struggle to prosperity. The rise of the plantation. Economy, royal rule, and the expansion of slavery unlocked Georgia's economic potential. Large-scale rice and indigo plantations flourished along the coast and river deltas. The export of these crops tied Georgia firmly into the Atlantic world, bringing wealth to planters and integrating the colony into Britain's mercantile system. Urban development. Savannah, founded as a compact planned city, grew rapidly as a commercial hub. Brunswick, Augusta, and other settlements expanded, driven by trade, shipping, and the growing demand for plantation goods. Trade and the Atlantic world. Georgia's ports bustled with activity. British ships brought manufactured goods, while Georgia exported rice, indigo, timber, and deerskins. The colony also traded with the Caribbean and other North American colonies, becoming a vital node in the imperial trade network. The dark side. The slave trade. With prosperity came tragedy. The slave trade became central to Georgia's economy, and the colony became a major market for enslaved Africans. The human cost was immense, with generations of African-descended people subjected to forced labor, violence, and family separation. Demographic shifts, growth, diversity, and displacement. Population growth. Georgia's population, stagnant under the trustees, boomed under royal rule. The promise of land and the legalization of slavery attracted settlers from across the British Atlantic. English, Scots-Irish, Germans, and Africans, both free and enslaved. Rural and urban migration. The expansion of plantations drew settlers further inland and upriver, pushing the boundaries of colonial Georgia. Urban centers like Savannah grew, with a cosmopolitan mix of merchants, artisans, and laborers. Indigenous displacement. As new lands were claimed and settled, indigenous peoples, particularly the Creek and Cherokee, were increasingly displaced. Treaties were signed, broken, and renegotiated, and native communities were pushed westward. The struggle for land and sovereignty would define Georgia's relationship with native nations for decades to come. The changing face of the colony. By the eve of the American Revolution, Georgia was a far cry from the trustees' model colony. Its population was larger, more diverse, and more deeply divided by race and class. The largest demographic shifts were driven by the arrival of enslaved Africans, the influx of planters and merchants, and the displacement of native peoples. Seventh, the political evolution. From subjects to citizens, the rise of local government. The creation of the Commons House of Assembly gave Georgians a measure of self-government. Planters and merchants dominated this body, shaping laws to suit their interests. Political factionalism. As in other colonies, political life in Georgia became increasingly contentious. Rival factions vied for power, often divided by regional interests, coastal elite versus backcountry settlers, economic priorities, and attitudes toward British authority. The growth of colonial identity. The experience of self-government, economic expansion, and shared grievances against imperial policies fostered a sense of colonial identity. By the 1760s, Georgia was increasingly aligned with the other American colonies, participating in resistance to British taxes and sending delegates to the Continental Congress. 8. The legacy of the Trustee Period. What remained? Not all of the trustees' ideals vanished. Their emphasis on religious toleration, except for Catholics, urban planning, the unique layout of Savannah, and public charity left a mark on Georgia's culture. The early years produced a tradition of civic engagement and public debate that persisted even as the colony became more hierarchical. Lessons learned. The utopianism of the trustees, while admirable, was ultimately unsustainable in the face of economic reality, settler preferences, and imperial pressures. Their experiment, like so many in colonial America, was reshaped by the demands and desires of those who actually lived in Georgia. Seeds of change. The end of the Trustee Period did not mean an end to change. The social, economic, and demographic shifts set in motion by the transition to royal rule prepared Georgia for its role in the coming American Revolution. The colony's embrace of plantation agriculture and slavery tied it to global markets, while its political development and demographic diversity shaped its identity as one of the most dynamic and conflicted of the original 13 colonies. Conclusion. From utopia to reality. The story of Georgia, yes, Trustee Period, is a story of ideals meeting the hard edge of reality. Oglethorpe's departure symbolized the end of direct engagement, the collapse of the trustees' authority, and the colony's transition to a new era. The shift to royal colony status in 1752 brought prosperity and growth, but also inequality, slavery, and displacement. In the process, Georgia was transformed from a social experiment into a thriving, but deeply divided colony at the heart of the British Atlantic world. The legacies of the Trustee Period, both good and ill, would shape Georgia's future and continue to echo in its history for generations to come.